I'm back. Happy Thursday as I'm recording this. I think. Sorry for the absenteeism this week, but geez, I actually have other other jobs that must be attended to at some points. And this week was corporate. They call them offsites. You get together, you talk about stuff. It was fine. It was good, actually, but it just took up time. And since I had to be somewhere outside of my apartment, there was no good place to stream. I was even thinking, like, could I stream from the office if I brought my laptops and brought some kind of setup? But no, there's nowhere. And plus, we were booked. Hey, Gashrin. Hey, Slicarius. Thanks for hanging out there. I am honored and that anyone would clear anything off their schedules to watch these things live. So I appreciate that you took that effort. Frederick says, let's see, if trolls could live under a bridge, skeletons could live in a graveyard, where are the orcs going to live? That's a good point. I mean, the orcs have to be below, I assume you're talking about dungeons, but do orcs have to be below ground? I don't know. Let me give you the genesis for this. So we went through the Gygax challenge over the past 5 weeks, which was a lot of fun, a lot of stuff I need to still flesh out, but a great exercise. One of the things I was thinking, I didn't really talk about it on stream, because the streams, since I've only got an hour for each piece, so focused on going through the steps and doing everything that, but one thing I was thinking about kind of besides is, one of the whole things that I think a lot of people do with hex crawls, if you're doing, you read with West Marches, and just the whole technique is, hey, you put a dungeon there, capital D dungeon. If you've done the Chicago Wiz 3-hex method, it's sort of, you pick this dungeon, you pick something else, you pick the hometown, throw those in the 3 hexes and go. For the Gygax 75 challenge, here's your home base, here's the village, and then here's the D dungeon, and not necessarily the dungeon of the world, but this major dungeon that you're kind of going to be involved with, and then you sort of fill in things around it. And then I was thinking about my home game, which we could actually get to play as we're on, not I wouldn't say a hiatus, but we've been having scheduling difficulties of late. But in my home game, my party is for the most part disinterested in dungeons. Not that they don't like a good dungeon or they don't find it exciting or interesting to go in the dungeons, because they do. And I've been running them through a more and more homebrewy, modified version of the Caves of Chaos lately. And that has a dungeon that we get into. But the dungeon, especially the, say, capital D dungeon, that is the kind of be-all, end-all of the world, the focus of the world, if you will, it's not for them. And I think there are a couple reasons for this, and I wonder if other folks might find that as well, but that when you read a lot of the guidance, you listen, watch a lot of the guidance, it has a lot to do with the dungeon. And of course, we're playing some version of some flavor of a game that either is itself or is based loosely or closely on a game called Dungeons and Dragons. They think, well, dungeons are in the word, so shouldn't dungeons be at the forefront of all of our thoughts? What does Gandalf say about Sauron, right? His mind, our minds are ever reaching for turning our attentions towards the dungeons. But do we need to? Do we have to? Are there other options that we can use instead? Are there things we could do? And if you're feeling it, or if you're creating a hex crawl or you're running one and you're not feeling the dungeon particularly, and your party may not be feeling the dungeon, do you maybe find yourself compelled to push a dungeon in there, even though your heart is saying, I'm not really interested in the dungeon, or my players aren't interested in the dungeon, but everything I read and I hear and I watch and I listen to, everything says, gotta have a dungeon. Kind of what options are there? I'm going to, Ian says all the world is a dungeon. That is something I'm going to get into, Ian, because I think really that is kind of the big thing is that anything can be the dungeon in the meta sense of what we think of a dungeon. Though often in a lot of the guidance and stuff that we encounter online, people are talking about a particular kind of type of location called the dungeon. But I definitely feel like that, yes, in the dungeon, the world could very well be the dungeon. Frederick says, the Rift's Vampire Kingdom sourcebook had great ideas for circus and sideshows. Well, I guess that's could be kind of a dungeon. And then Brian Smith, hey, Brian, says, I hate when the day job gets in the way of the good stuff. Yes, that was my feeling the last couple of days. uh, how my the day job get in the way of the stuff that I really want to do. So I'm trying to be a little bit better about getting stuff done. So I did put together this bullet list. So I think there's a couple of things here. I think Ian kind of touched on it. I'm not sure whether he meant to or not, but that essentially, if you don't love the dungeon as a specific type of place, and here I'm going to define dungeon, capital D dungeon is, I know they can exist in different places, but basically some location that exists underground, and I'm underground or at least maybe in levels, can be big, can be small. I'm not trying to get into the fine details of, oh, but this is a tower. Is that a dungeon? But it's going upwards. Some collection of levels, could be massive, could be small, filled with bad guys, obstacles, and treasures. I guess dangerous places that are generally subdivided into levels that you're going to delve into, find stuff, and hopefully make it out of alive. Ty says that every place is some dangerous location that only experts go to because normal people will die there. That's what I think of when I place a dungeon. Yes, I think that's a good way to look at it as well. In terms of what we see mostly in things like the Chicago Wiz or recently the Gygax 75 is we're generally talking about places usually below ground. They can be above ground. These sorts of and I think generally they veer towards being bigger, though they don't have to be. You can have just a single spot dungeon, but I think often the guidance leads us to having more or less sprawling types of locations, because whether you're doing West Marches style campaign or you're looking at kind of, well, how did they run it back in the day, sort of OSR-ish dungeons, they tend to be at least bigger places that you're going to on multiple sessions. So at least a few levels that you maybe hit it up multiple sessions. Certainly if you're looking at the stuff like Castle Greyhawk and some of the, I'm going to use mega dungeon terms here, they just take, untold numbers of levels, potentially infinite. I think in talking about, it might have been Castle Greyhawk, it might have been something else. I think it was Gygax mentioned, that they would just keep adding, that they always had sort of, you always left some gray area, or not even gray area. They could literally, you go there one week and then the next week you go there and someone's opened up a stairwell or a hole to some further level, or a room you couldn't get into before. Now it's open and it's a stairwell, a pit, something else. There was always this opportunity to add more levels to the dungeon. They could almost exist as some kind of infinite Mobius strip-like space with just places continuing to just expand. But that may not interest you as a GM. It might not interest you as a party. For example, my players, I like dungeons. I like running dungeons. I like playing in dungeons. But I also like a lot of the other stuff. And a part of what spurred me onto this was that in my game, my party has also been interested in a lot of that other stuff. And that other stuff tends to not exist in the dungeon. A lot of the social, political, and geopolitics that are happening. Oh, I want to get in good with this person, and all these things they're going on. What are these guys trying to do over here? What is this? The religious faction, what are they up to? Oh, and we got this Viscount, what is he going on? And Bogwig's out there who's like this, mucking up the works. None of these folks, and that could be something that I could say, well, that's my problem. This is something you say, well, Todd, this is your problem. These guys don't have anything to do directly with dungeons. Now, it could be my problem in that I could insert them in dungeons, or I could put things that they're after in dungeons, but a lot of times the politics doesn't necessarily center on the dungeon. I could turn it and say, okay, this dungeon's a valuable resource. Everybody knows it, so everyone wants to own it. It just hasn't seemed a natural fit for me. It may not seem a natural fit for your games, particularly if part of what makes the dungeon a kind of a thing is the fact that it's somewhat unknown. It hasn't been just it's not something that's been prospected and then, oh, we got, you might have gold prospectors in, old West California, and so you have, dungeon prospectors. No, these are things that part of what makes them dangerous and full of still of valuables that the party can find is the fact that, yes, as somebody mentioned, I think it was Ty, that they are super dangerous, but also they're lost. You found the lost city. Now you get to explore it. If it was not lost, probably enough silly, goofy people would be marching in there that just by nature of luck, they would have triggered and gotten rid of all the traps, probably overwhelmed at least the low-level bad guys that are down there just because they're going to keep coming in. The local lord would be putting a tax in front of you. It would end up being like the entrance in the Underdark in that tavern in Waterdeep, where now it's become an attraction where you pay pay 50 cents or whatever silver or gold to go down into the dungeon. So in my game, and maybe in a lot of your games too, when folks are really interested in, ooh, what's going on in the towns and what are these different relationships between these factions, you might find that the dungeon doesn't end up being the central thing that it is when you look at a lot of these things on paper. Let me just hit the chat here. Ian says that through the use of node and or hex space exploration and scaling of time and distance, exploring anything can function just like a dungeon. Yep, I agree. And then Frederick Gore says we could do recon. I had a character actually survive a helicopter drop into VC territory. Wow, that's pretty good. Elfbait says, hey, Elfbait says, I'm having a heck of a time getting their players to do stuff. I do not remember it being this hard to motivate players. I think that, yeah, I think Elfbait, that is definitely a trick. Or I don't know, a trick. It's kind of that meeting of the minds. I think I've been lucky enough that my players are very good, and I've, to the extent that I've guided them along into being self-guided, I guess I've been somewhat successful in that, but they've shown a lot of interest in their own thing. And I think there's also that part where that session 0, when you're pitching your campaign, is I got direct feedback before I even created the campaign and kind of what did the players I was playing with want. You know, what kind of game did they want? And they wanted a lot of intrigue and politics. I think it ended up being something they want, like Dune meets King Arthur with some fairy stuff. And that's kind of how I built it. And part of when we started discussing that was that a lot of the things that they liked about Dune wasn't the sci-fi stuff. It wasn't the spice. It wasn't it was the political factions and all that maneuvering and intrigue. And so they were naturally wanted that, and so I brought that in the game, and they're very interested in those intrigues. And those intrigues just don't happen to take place a lot of in dungeons. Now they could. I suppose I could have worked things that these dungeons have more political things, but for now, you know, they don't. And so the party, I think, found themselves, like with my first dungeon, that I created kind of I didn't really position it as a mega dungeon, but a dungeon, multiple levels near their home settlement, was not the most interesting thing in the world to them. They were just interested in all this other stuff. And so they kind of went in the dungeon a couple times, and then other things pulled them out, and they haven't gone back. And I think the same thing with this dungeon. They have specific tasks, and they kind of back themselves into a corner politically that kind of put them in like, okay, we have to figure out this thing with this dungeon because we're not welcome back home until we do it. So they've sort of boxed themselves into, well, we either got to figure out this dungeon or find a new land to go to, because we've sort of put ourselves in a corner. But if they hadn't been, then that might even be a similar situation where they'd be much more interested in the things going on in the overworld than they are in the corridors and rooms of the underworld. Now, there are problems there, or issues that we need to look at if we're going to concentrate in the overworld, which I'll probably get into shortly, because the dungeon fulfills such a central feature for our, at least the conventional OSR play, that if you were going to remove it in some way or scale it back, then we need to figure out what to put in its place. But let me just, Slack. Boy, too much work talk. Yes, work comms are on Slack. The chat got a lot of stuff going on. So let me see what is happening back here. Slackarius, let's see, says, I think what I like about the dungeon compared to the exploration is that the dungeon is a permanent site to return to an exploit, but ultimately it's up to you and your table and what you and your table is looking for. Yeah, I agree with that, Slackarius. I think that other places can be such sites. I think I'll get into that in a minute. It is, as Slackarius also says, just different variations on the exploration team. I think that's also true. Folks are trying to which I love, trying to figure out Elfbait and his problem of the players who can't be motivated, or that he's having a hard time motivating. I think to Slackarius's point about a dungeon being a site that you're going to return to over and over again, if you think about it, that can really be anything. So a couple of things I want to think about here. So another thing with the dungeon that can be an issue for some people is when the dungeon is your main, the thing, again, capital D dungeon is your capital thing, T thing. It puts a lot of pressure on this dungeon. It's got to be really interesting because people got to be coming back to it over and over again. It's got to be complex. You got to have a lot. You want to have a lot of things coming out because this is where you're going to be challenging your players. So you want to think about not only just the challenging part, but just making it interesting, making it feel lived in, giving it things to discover, making the things interesting from just a fictional standpoint, but then interesting also as the game portion where you're trying to figure it out. Those puzzles, not necessarily the here's the room with a Sudoku on the floor you have to solve, but just kind of the puzzle of the place, figuring out those workings. Those are fun things as players, and you're trying to figure out how to do that. And then, particularly if you're not playing Funhouse Dungeons, it's making not only having those things that are interesting, that are not going to get boring, but then doing that when you're trying to give it some kind of unity of place. If we're going to the caverns of the Goblin King, how do we keep that so that it feels like this place that is the caverns of the Goblin King, but that doesn't feel boring, that you're just running into goblins everywhere and doing all these things. So there's a lot of pressure on doing this dungeon in a way that you think is right and interesting and worth the time and effort that you and your table are going to put into it. And it can be hard to deliver that. It can be very hard. That's a lot of pressure. And the dungeon's also your main, is probably your main source. I would say probably it is your main source of experience points. This is where loot is. Loot is in dungeons. Bringing out of loot is how you get to XP. If you're playing the ye old loot for experience points, then dungeons are where you're getting your experience points. So that also makes it very important. So I want to talk about a couple of things. Hey, Elfbait, feel free to hijack the stream. No worries on the chat. I can always dig through the chat to find non-Elfbait related stuff, but hey, you got folks here who are tuned in to helping you out. Use their wisdom, and I can just keep blathering on in the background about dungeon stuff. This is watered down apple cider for the working man, one of my favorites. So then a couple of things, right? So we can get down to defining the dungeon. Usually when you read a lot of the guidance, as I mentioned before, dungeons, talking about big, sprawling spaces, multiple levels, it is the center. But as folks have mentioned, anywhere can be dangerous, pretty much. Anywhere can have traps, obstacles, all the puzzly, just environmentally puzzly places. It doesn't have to be a sprawling underground or above ground, within walls space. You could have a dungeon. So I guess maybe the best thing is to split out the meta talking about dungeons. So as GMs, what does the dungeon signify in a meta sense versus in the fiction what it is? In a meta sense, okay, we're gonna have obstacles. It's going to be basically as I think, I forget who mentioned in the chat. It's basically maybe it's Lacarius, a single fixed site, fixed in the geography and the landscape. Hey, X marks the spot. That's where it is, and it's gonna stay there. I suppose that you could have magic dungeons that move, but for the most part, hey, that's it. It's in Hex 36.35, and that's where it is. And that it will, in a sense, reward going back and visiting it over and over again. There might be new things, intrigue, it's got stuff. So now imagine that taking some of those elements, but now looking and say, okay, it's not going to be an actual dungeon. We're not going to make it all underground or in a building in a single kind of structure. And but we want to keep some of these dungeon elements. What might that look like? Maybe it looks like let's say an overgrown Mayan temple complex. In this case, sure, you've got pyramids that which would become dungeons, but maybe they're not. Maybe, I know I've read some of the archaeology that a lot of times they had, they were sort of rooms on the top, but the whole thing wasn't hollow, filled with lots of rooms. It was basically stacked on top of, basically made out of artificial earthen mounds, so to speak, below the facades of stone. So they're big objects with a couple of rooms on top, but you've got, that becomes the area. The surrounding jungle becomes that area. The obstacles, they're not rooms and corridors with traps, but they could be snares and pit traps that are out in the wild. You could have quicksand and swampy water that can be difficult. Different animals, things that plants, vines, all kinds of things, man-eating plants, vines that will try to grab you and swallow and tangle you and strangle you, whatever the animals that live in the forest, all these different parts of the terrain in a fixed area that can have kind of a map to it. If you imagine, like archaeologists will find out there, that certain traces, if you can find them, you can find the traces of the old roads that are still somewhat clear of all this nasty stuff because of, hundreds of thousands of years of having use. They haven't totally been swallowed up. It's just that people have forgotten where they went to or where they were going, but still those can be things to discover. They can be like paths on the road. You still have the freedom to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to get off this path, wander off into the straight jungle and just bushwhack, which is fine, but they still can have that kind of a mapping, pathing aspect that you can leverage if you want to do it. You certainly have essentially a fixed location, and it can have those repeat visits. Maybe there's ley lines passing through, so magical energy, so that things are going to come there. You could look at kind of straight up archaeological digs, cities built on top of older cities, older structures built on top of older structures. What's buried down there? Can we find traces of things on the ground, and then take a crew, take some shovels and things, and try to dig down and see if there's any treasure there. Barrel mounds could be one, like you find in Ireland. I forget the name of the large barrel mound I got to visit once a long time ago. These big mounds, how do we get in? What do we get out of it? Those things can all be locations that can fulfill some of your dungeon prospects. They can be sources of loot, which then in turn becomes experience points. They can give you some of the things that you might be looking for, these fixed locations that reward multiple visits. They can turn into monster lairs. Certainly, if you excavate out one of these mounds and then go away, probably something's going to move into it. So that can still be something. Same thing with, you found this lost temple complex and you clear it out a bit. Maybe something else moves in. Certainly, if you look at some of the aspects that make these, or you think about what makes this location interesting, or why were people here, and of course you add the sort of fantastic elements in there. You might think about, they're magical sources of power. Maybe there are gates to the Feywild. There's some other planar gates that are nearby that make these things kind of, or that they were centers. And now that you've cleared it out, and now that you've taken care of whatever peril that was essentially holding things down, okay, well, there was some dark spectral force that was keeping this place in shadow, and we just killed it or banished it or did whatever. Okay, great. Now we've left. Well, maybe something now moves in. Oh, well, you've now opened up. So there was a lake there that was a gateway to the plane of water, elemental plane of water. But there was some weird Loch Ness monster in the lake, and so it was clogged up, or it was closed. The gate was closed. Oh, but you defeated the monster, and you did whatever. You've cleaned up the lake. You've gotten some stuff, and you've left. Well, now there's this working elemental plane of water gate that's here. What might come out of there that you might have to visit again? So you can still take some of these features and place it elsewhere, or turn them into something that might be more interesting to the party, that might fit in more with the kind of overworld sort of politics, whatever that's going on. Because a lot of things, I think, for the dungeons, I was going to say another tack could be. So I guess if we're going to say, if one method is to take the stuff what you would map below ground and just put it on the surface. You were going to make this a dungeon, just make it an above ground thing. Take your underground location, and instead of rooms and hallways, you have paths and buildings. Bam. You could basically just do that, and it becomes something that might appeal to your players in a different way. It could be something that fulfills the same kind of meta goals as a dungeon, but just doing that little thing might work on your players differently. Some folks might be hesitant to go underground because of all the horrible connotations, even for the best of us, of all the horrible things that happen to your party when you go underground, even though that's kind of exciting and fun. But then you say, oh no, it's some buildings. You don't have to go into this big dungeon. You just have to go into some buildings. Oh really? Well, that's great. I mean, it's just as deadly, just as horrible, but now you've put it in a slightly different context, and that makes all the difference for it could be for your dungeon delvers. Let's see, or I should say your potential dungeon delvers. Brian Smith says, in the old fantasy stuff, I feel like the dungeon was always the final test of the hero. In video games, we're used to hitting dungeons constantly. Yeah, absolutely. Though it can be the test can be a lot of different things, right? There usually is, if you follow, the hero's journey, the Joseph Campbell kind of things. I mean, sure, we run into that, but I think that can be kind of any location. Maybe we have been trained a lot to think of it as the dungeon, but I think even then, the Joseph Campbell folks would say we're looking at the metaphysical dungeon. What is the metaphysical dungeon, and what kind of things does the metaphysical dungeon have? What is it as a metaphor? And you can apply that metaphor to other locations. The other thing you do is you can spread it out. Instead of one of the things that's come in with Hexcrawl, I think it's a common question, is okay, I've got this Hexcrawl. Chicago Wiz says 3 hexes, but I couldn't do the 3 hexes. Maybe I did the Gygax 75, and now I've got 30, 40 hexes across my piece of paper that I have to fill in. what do I do, right? So I have the dungeon with the capital D, but now I want to put points of interest, or I've read things saying, oh, I should have one. Some sources say roll a D4, some sources say roll a D6. I got to put points of interest all over this damn thing. What do I do? Well, what you could do is take your one dungeon that you were going to build 4 levels deep. Suddenly that becomes 4 different points of interest on a map, each one with, maybe, as I went into before, having above ground structures. So sure, taken singly, each one of them is just one place, but then together you now have essentially 4 dungeons, or 4 levels of a dungeon, but you spread them out horizontally instead of vertically. And not only that, but now they give you 4 different points of interest. So you're taking the same work you would have put into your one dungeon with a capital D with 4 levels. Now instead you have 4 locations, each one with say 1 level of a dungeon. And not only that, but it gives you a way to really flesh out your hex map on world building it out in a way that I think will really give them a lived in space. So what you can do is, instead of saying, okay, I had say my Mayan, I'm doing some kind of South American RPG and I have this Mayan analogs, and I was going to create this one dungeon that's all Mayan. Well, now I'm splitting it up, and I'm going to say I'm going to have 3 hexes, 3 levels, or maybe I'll say 4 hexes of levels. I'm going to put them out, put each one, and I can not only am I putting them on the map, so now each one takes up 4 hexes instead of just being in one dungeon. Now I can think of ways to link those locations together in interesting ways. It might even help me, because now I can think about, well, if I was going to say, because I think sometimes you think about dungeon levels, this is going to be a little bit of a sidetrack, but I think I'm going to come back around. It'll be helpful. We often think about, well, what are the theming? And Gygax75, theme your dungeon levels. Well, what's the theming like? And that can be difficult. I sometimes have trouble with it. I think it often comes up as, well, how do you theme these things out? Particularly if you're not going gonzo, just funhouse style. Gygax had these crazy, this one's just going to be all fire elementals over here, and then it's going to be all mazes over here. And it didn't really matter at that point in his conception at that time of the dungeon, that these things didn't really fit together ultimately. It was more about the experience and kind of just the fun of it. But I like to think about, well, how all these things fit together. If I'm thinking about it in levels of a dungeon, for me, just the way I think about dungeons, sometimes it can be difficult. But I'm thinking as I have 3 locations. What are those locations? I can think about, okay, this one was a government center. This one was a religious center. Maybe the one over here was a commercial center. And then we have maybe say the 4th one's residential. Like, boom, like that to me, it's like, okay, now I really can see that. I can see how they all fit together. They can still have sort of a layout in terms of, say, levels, which I can think about, well, the residential one, maybe that's the one that's the least haunted, or has all the low level stuff in there, and then these ones are tougher. And I can also link things around. If you hit this one, it's going to have maybe they'll all have matching symbology that will not only help me in terms of just world building these spaces, but relating them together. I can still build clues that, hey, in the residential section, will give you clues to, say, the governmental section or the commercial center. This one, I can still lay all that stuff up like I would be doing levels of a dungeon, in the same way that you could end up, just like they say with a lot of dungeon design, is you want to have the abilities to enter in different ways into different levels. Potentially you have all that because it's out in your overworld. So your party could, sure, they may be more likely to hit the first dungeon that's because that hex is in front of them, but there's nothing stopping them from looping around or doing something else. So you can still have some interesting ways with how the party arrives at the dungeon. You can still have all the stuff, except you don't have a physical dungeon. Your dungeon is thus these different cities, towns, villages, temple complexes. The other thing too is that oftentimes, in terms of, if you take this tack that I'm suggesting and take these dungeons, bring them above ground, you're converting rooms and hallways to buildings and paths, roads, canals, whatever. In terms of real world inspiration, you're gonna have a lot more. It's kind of hard to find if you're looking for real world dungeons. There's not a lot out there. But you can look at something and say, okay, I want to have canals and I want to have this stuff. Well, I can go look at endless images of Venice or some other town, some other village that's all on poles or all full of canals, and all of a sudden get a lot more, in a sense, inspiration from that stuff. in my mind, I feel like a lot more free because I don't have to worry necessarily if I'm worried at all about, well, it's all underground and I'm not playing a Gonzo game, so I'm not going to have it open up into like the hollow earth all of a sudden. When I'm below ground, there are certain limits I have to deal with, limitations potentially. When you're above ground, a lot of those limits disappear. Sure, you certainly have freedom of movement for the party is there. You certainly have a lot more verticality you could potentially play with is there. You can have below ground elements. I could have, oh, well, hey, this building does have, just this building is going to have some vertical rooms that go down into the ground. It's just not the defining feature anymore. And then architecturally and everything, I can really have a lot more, I think, interesting potentials to play with. Not that you can't get there in a dungeon, but I think oftentimes, even just in our brains, we might feel those limits of being in corridors, hallways, kind of thing, where you take that out and suddenly you go, wow, I got all this stuff I can play with, but I can still have that sort of dungeon experience in many, many ways. Let's see, just going to back up through the chat here and see what kind of stuff I missed. Brian, okay, I saw that one. I saw Brian Smith's comment. Slakaria says, I think ideally the players want the mix of exploring and the new and discovering the world, as well as delving deeper into a specific Big D dungeon. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend a lot on your players. And I think there is an element where you can train your party. I think that's something. I know that's one of the things that I think is why new players are so appealing to GMs is because we get to do that training. My players are mostly new. They don't have a ton of experience, which means they don't have some really hard, concrete idea of what playing is, about all these different elements are. So you get to kind of shape them. You get to kind of say, well, look, think in these ways. And they're really open to it because they don't have a bunch of experience that's going to be telling them, no, the game is this. No, this is what I want to do. It's like, okay, like they're more like, oh yeah, I can just do that. Like, yeah. Sometimes with players who are experienced, it can work, depending on what you're trying to do, it can work against you and potentially against them and their enjoyment and interfacing with the game because they have a certain idea of what the game is. Like, this is the game. And when you may be trying to do something broader or something off to an angle, sometimes getting them to turn and say, no, let's look this way can be difficult. With new players, they don't know. So you got 360 degrees and they're willing to go in pretty much whatever direction you want to go, presuming you can kind of work them towards it and talk to them and present it to them in a way that's sensible and that they want to, that aligning with kind of, oh, these are the things I want to do. See, Ty says, the way I've been running my Hexcrawl is that the players are famous and thus get into trouble wherever they go, attracting the attention of warlords, tasked with quests, etc. Yeah, I think that's one of the things I think is kind of the unspoken, I don't even know it's really unspoken, but implied things that happens to your party. The interesting, Ty, is you start off with them being kind of known, whereas I usually start with them being unknown, but they're kind of, I mean, the funny thing is in my game, the party of their own volition wants to make themselves famous, or at least one of the players, he seems to have this thing about wanting to gain fame and notoriety as a hero. And so it's been really interesting because they've made sort of practical decisions and not so heroic decisions about stuff, but then have had to live with the consequences of that versus their image, their self-image, and the image they've tried to promote as being heroes. And that's part of why they found themselves boxed into this kind of do or die procedure. And if you remember my stories about Bogwig, that kind of got them into trouble because they basically just kidnapped this guy out in the wilderness. He was just a guy. He was just a random encounter. I rolled it up and it was like, okay, rolling up it was like rolled up and you run into this magician. So I made this kind of crazy guy. And it was even sort of, I wasn't even sure whether he was a magician or not, but he was certainly presenting himself as a magician. And I just played it as a social encounter. They surprised each other out there in the wilderness. And the party, for some reason, decided to like just basically really just kind of kidnap him. I mean, this was like keel haul. I don't know, keel haul. What's the word when you get just, I forget the term where you would just get kidnapped by, the Navy and you would wake up and you're suddenly a sailor on a ship because they just took you. I know there's a name for it. I can't remember it, but that's what they basically did to him. They were like, all right, you're part of our group now, whether you want to or not. One, the guy was a little bit loony, and I'm surprised they didn't give them more pause. And second, rolling and playing through it, he was like, I don't want to be your thing. So they got into combat with some creatures. He escaped, and then he gets back to the nearest town. I had him wander in this town, and they literally had one of their guys there in town, basically, talking up about the group because they were all about like calling themselves. They have a name, and they're like, yeah, we're the so and so, and they made a point of saying like you're a part of the group now. And then the guy escapes, and then of course they had someone back at this town who was telling people, oh yeah, we're from the next town over, and you should go and ask for us, and we're all whatever. So then, while they were gone for a couple of weeks or whatever the time was, out in the wilderness, this kind of loony guy, but he had some good charisma and stuff, went back and got them in all kinds of trouble. But it all started because, well, one, they kidnapped the guy, but two, that they were presenting themselves as these like trying to set themselves up as heroes of the realm. So when they get themselves back home, and there's they'd been putting out this propaganda basically of themselves as this hero group, but then this other guy's talking about how they tried to kidnap him and hurt him and do whatever. It made for some interesting, fun gaming situations. Let's see. Brian Smith says the dungeon always represents true danger, thus the earning reward at the end. The corpses of previous heroes. The dungeon needs to be a place capable of killing a hero in whatever flavor you like. Yep. I mean, that's Brian Smith is certainly true. I think the point I'm making here is that, and it's not like I'm making some kind of super, this has never been talked about before, but that, yeah, but you can do those things, and it doesn't have to be in a dungeon space. If you think about shows, say Game of Thrones, there are lots of situations that can be rife with danger, that can be proving grounds that don't end up being dungeons. You can end up in how many of those rulers of the different kingdoms in Westeros are kind of just nutty, and will just, if you're on their bad side, they might just put you to death, and you got to figure out how to just get out of this situation, either by figuring out how to do what this person wants, so they let you go, or if you need to earn their alliance or allegiance or something out of them, but get out of there alive, or just escape because they've either imprisoned you or quasi imprisoned you, or it's just full of just bad guys who are going to slit your throat if they realize who you are. All those things fulfill those same functions, but you're not going down into a dungeon. And I think if there's a takeaway from this, and I'm hoping people will get to, maybe I can help people down that road, is that if you don't find the dungeon with a capital D, the place that speaks to you or your players to do some of these things, you could still do these things and just don't put them in the dungeon, or just repurpose these same goals and just put them elsewhere. Just give a new coat of paint, much like you take a monster in the monster manual and you want to present it differently. So you take its stats, but you call it something else. You can take the stuff that we call a dungeon, and you can do some other things, put it in a different context, and putting it in a different context might help you as a GM get over the hump. If you struggle with dungeons, if you don't particularly love dungeons, it might help your players. If your players don't particularly love dungeons, or they don't particularly speak to them, you could move this stuff around, because a lot of the stuff that we do with dungeons can be done elsewhere. You just need to kind of think it through. You need to think about, okay, how am I going to do this? If I'm not going to have the dungeon, I got to figure out how I'm going to reward XP. Where are they going to find, if I'm doing XP for gold, where are they going to find these loots? Or if I'm going to say, you know what, I don't just want to have loot just hanging out in the overworld because that doesn't make sense to me, blah, blah, blah. Then figure out other alternatives for that. I like to do loot for exploration. You can give folks loot for finding these locations. You can give them loot for mapping, or you can give them XP for finding locations. You give them XP for doing some kind of exploration work. Like, okay, we're going to map it out, or we're going to, we do something, or we're going to make a trail to this location. First, we might bushwhack our way in, but now we're going to physically set up a trail for it, and we could figure out the mechanics for that. That might reward XP. We could reward XP for bringing knowledge of this place back. We could reward XP for certain types of treasures. It's not just gold and kind of valuables, but maybe we're going to say, like, for some narrower types of treasure that aren't necessarily valuable, that someone wants it just to want it, but it's kind of like that knowledge. Okay, if you can bring scrolls from here back to wizards, spells that were heretofore unknown, or magical research that was unknown, that will reward you. I mean, in a sense, that's just treasure in different ways, but you can really kind of come up with these different, kind of pointing again towards different contexts, different things you can do to pull it out here that might be easier for you to visualize and for your party, because dungeons don't speak to everybody. and it may be harder. I think probably for myself, I find it easier to visualize a town or a ruined location like that than I do some deep mega dungeon. So for me, if I say, okay, I'm going to take this stuff, I'm going to put it all in this ruined town that's out there, and all the elements that I would put in the dungeon, I'm just going to put in this town instead. You might think about it and go, oh yeah, that's a lot easier for me. That hits my creativity, that hits my inspiration node more than what's on level 4 of this dungeon that doesn't necessarily speak to me. So that's kind of what I wanted to get into with this, because I was thinking, you know what, I could be running my game without any particular dungeons and not really lose much. I don't think the party would mind that much if nothing was really dungeon centric. Not that there wouldn't be locations that are dungeons beneath castles, buildings that have levels below, all that stuff. But to a large extent, my game doesn't focus on dungeons, and it runs just fine. But a lot of the guidance you read online tends to point people towards focusing on dungeons. So really, this whole class is really about is really exploring this idea of, what if you don't want to point your game towards a dungeon? Can you do it? Can you move away from dungeons as a central thing? Not that they don't exist in the world or that they're not there, but as the be all end all. And I think the answer is yes. Some of it is if your party's into the politics and visiting different locations, and you become town centric. You have a lot of towns and villages and different factions, local lords, whatever, that are all vying for power and influence. Your party can do a lot of stuff with that and never have to go into a basement, and still have lots of intrigue, lots of danger, lots of obstacles. Okay, you were invited to this weird lord's castle. Now you're kind of trapped inside. You're not a prisoner in chains, but you've been told that, hey, you can't really leave, but you have information you need to get out to your liege lord, or maybe just to get out to somebody else. You want to make a different deal, so you got to figure out how to get out. All these kinds of things can be a lot of it. And someone might say, well, that just sounds like you're in a dungeon. And the answer is, you are in a dungeon, but we're not calling it a dungeon. As a player, you may not think of it as a dungeon. You're thinking of it, oh, I'm in this lord's castle, and now I got to sneak to get out instead of trying to sneak to get in. But that could be another thing, is the castle gates are closed to you, but I need to get in because I need to deliver a message to this other person, but they're not giving me access to that person, so I got to sneak in. Also a dungeon, but the context, just a little change in the context can make a whole world of difference to your players, to you, to everything. So I'm kind of wanting to, I don't know, I feel like I'm not trying to make myself so grandiose as I'm opening your mind, but I'm just trying to say, hey, you could look at these things in a broader way, in a less specific way, and still have a lot of success, still come up with a great world, still make it really interesting, and do everything. Don't have to have that capital D dungeon if it doesn't work for you, doesn't work for your party. I don't even mean it doesn't work, but really doesn't speak to you or speak to your party as much as some other elements of the world. Because like I said, for my party, I know that they seem to be really interested in trying to maneuver their way up through the power structure of the overworld, gaining fame, gaining fortune, gaining influence, playing in between these different factions. That's the stuff they're interested in a lot. And a lot of that just doesn't exist in the dungeon. Now, the struggle for me has been, though it's a little bit alleviated now since they're kind of in a dungeon right now, or they're not kind of, they are, is translating that stuff into experience. Because like I said a little bit before, is if you're going to decrease dungeons as a focus, there's that, you get that XP deficit. My party was spending a lot of time doing other stuff, and I realized like they're having a lot of fun doing this, but they're not gaining a lot of experience points. So I went back to them and said, how can we, I want to mechanize the stuff that you're doing. You're doing great stuff and you're having fun and you're doing things in the world, but just the way the game is set up by default is you're not getting rewarded for it in ways I should. You should, but I don't want it to be milestone. I don't want to do that. I've said this many times. I don't want to be in control of how you earn experience points. I want to put it as open, player facing to you as I can, and here are the goals. Here's kind of how much they're worth, and you decide what you want to handle. And that's been the thing that I've been working on now, is how to figure that out, because they've been so non-dungeon centric. And I've seen some different things. I know we looked at a couple of, it might have been when we did something, and I still have to go back and hit some more of the June OSR June Jam. I still have some left I need to cover, but I think there was one in there that tackled, or maybe we looked at it on one of the OSR Reddit roundups, I can't remember, that kind of took a look at like, well, how can I, pick some goals, and then we'll turn those goals into into experience points or just levels, but something in a way that's very player facing. That is definitely something you're going to have to think about if you're going to minimize dungeons in some ways, because it is that big, out of the box, at least you're playing kind of conventional OSR. That is your big source of experience. Let's see what else we have here. So Carrie says, I absolutely agree that any larger outdoor region like a forest, mountain range, lost continent could also absolutely fill the role of the Big D dungeon. Elfbait says they use dungeon for any adventure space. So Frederick Gork, I think, talking about player engagement, says, the simple method is randomly pick a player, ask them to fill in the hex, put whatever you feel should be in there, then ask another player to name the things. Just keep going until you have a map. That's a cool way to build a map. I like that. Elfbait says that their players are 6th level and may just be hitting adventure puberty, where they actually feel motivated to bite at things. Elfbait, one of the things they could be is they could be wary of dying, which I recognize awfully well as a GM and certainly as a player. I do not like to lose characters. I put it as a point of pride to not lose my characters. So I get very antsy about just going into places that seem really dangerous. And let me just take a drink here. I definitely feel that pause. So one of the things I think that is important in those instances, whether you're going into a dungeon underground, whether you're going into an overground dungeon, is one, trying to make sure that your players can get as much context on the place as possible. So it's not just unknown. It's not just they're looking at a hole in the ground or a cave that's just absolutely black and you have no way what's going to be in there until you get inside there. A lot of that context can help. It doesn't have to be in the first level of the dungeon necessarily. It can be on the outsides of the dungeon. It can be in the surrounding area. But all those signposts that we put up, all that contextualizing of places to kind of give at least a glimpse of, okay, here's what's here. Here's what we think is in here to some degree, right? Here's the thing that seems to be living out there. So that you can kind of gauge it a little bit. Because if you have no way of gauging it, it's going to feel a lot like, oh, that's just death waiting for us in there. And I like this character. I don't want to just kill this guy by delving in there. That's certainly one thing. Another thing to do is to give them compelling reasons to be going in there. If it is a hole in the earth, or even if it's not, even if they're all the signposts that say, okay, there's a younger dragon that's living here. By the looks of the charred ground around the entrance to this place, it's probably red. It's not a huge hole in the ground, and from the reports, it's not that big. But still, it's a dragon, and even a juvenile is not to be trifled with. So still, I might be thinking like, I don't know. I'd rather just knock around some goblins or talk to them, trick them, whatever, than deal with a dragon. So there's got to be compelling reasons also. Well, there's something in it that we need, and maybe there's a time limit. Hey, they're going to, if you look at Dragon Slayer, the movie Dragon Slayer, they, the dragon, at one point, I forget, there were different elements in the movie where some virgin was going to be sacrificed to the dragon. So there was these kind of clocks of, okay, they are every full moon, I forget what, every once a month, we're sacrificing some poor villager to the dragon. So I want to prevent this sacrifice that's coming up for reasons. I've got 3 weeks, or I got 3 days. So sure, I can be antsy, I can be wary, but if we're going to save this person, and I'm presuming that maybe I've taken on the quest, or I've decided, or maybe it's a loved one, or the loved one of an NPC that we are valuable, I got to go on and get there and deal with the dragon before they go up and take that sacrifice. Then I kind of got to do it at some point. And you find that thing where you find that thing you can the leverage you can, then that might push them to do it. And that's the thing that can get abused often. GMs, players will get wary of putting anybody in their backstory that they say their character cares about, because then the GM suddenly, suspending them over infernal flames, or putting them in the bottoms of dungeons and things like that. But when used appropriately, that can work. Brian Smith, Press Gang Shanghai. Yeah, I was trying to avoid Shanghai because I feel like it's probably, there's another. Press Gang might be the best term. That's probably right. I think there is something else too, but I was trying to avoid those ones like that are sort of, I don't know, I feel like have that are less flavored by cultural biases, but I'll remember. But yeah, Keel Hall, Press Gang. I think I don't know. Keel Hall maybe something else, but yeah, Press Gang definitely for sure. Hey, Don Rossavelli, glad you're here. Death Wish, Stratman Kudzu says Death Wish is Charles Bronson traveling through a dungeon. Yeah, pretty much. Kind of a horrible urban landscape, escape from New York. Same thing. It's basically an urban dungeon. A lot of things, right? To use another John Carpenter movie, The Thing. You're kind of trapped in this dungeon-like space with this nasty mimic sort of enemy moving about with a bunch of people and a ticking clock. Can you get rid of the thing before the thing kills of all of you during this time limit? Not only before the thing kills all of you, but also before help comes or something comes, which can then allows the thing out of this prison that you're all trapped in, this dungeon, and can get rescued. You could, there's lots of interesting things you could do with that sort of thing. Elvis says the last two adventures in their campaign have been dealing with the growing threat of a cult of Orcus. Last session pointed to a threat in the north. Cults of Orcus is very popular, but I do like a good cult of Orcus, for sure. And Elfbait, like I said, you could run that without a dungeon or capital D dungeon, or like we've been talking about, a metaphorical dungeon that's not in an actual. They don't have to be in the bottom of a dungeon. They could be in a citadel, in which getting to their central temple where they're going to be doing of course, I presume there's going to be some kind of ceremony at the end of it all to summon Orcus. Instead of having to go down 3 levels of a dungeon to get there, you could be having to get into town. Right? It's a walled town, so you got to get into the town, you got to get into the temple district, and then you have to get up to the tops of this temple where the ceremony is being held. Each one is essentially levels of a dungeon, but we're not going to call it a dungeon. It's not going to look like a dungeon, but it's going to have behind the scenes, if we were going to scrape away the facades, it would have all the things that a dungeon would have. Elfbay says they've run entire urban campaigns. Yep. I don't know if I've run an entirely urban campaign, but I definitely played in urban campaigns. I think there was one where I kind of, back in high school, I co-DM'd, co-played in a campaign that was pretty urban-centric. Frederick Ork says, threat in the north! How famous is this threat in the north? Maybe a rival hero has been dispatched, the players get cracking, someone else may beat them. Oh yeah, certainly, with all those kinds of things. And in Game of Thrones, though they mucked it up, had that kind of ticking clock, right? Winter is coming, and when this stuff when enough time has passed, this thing's going to happen. We might not know exactly when, but we know that every day that is getting closer to it, so hey, we better do something about it, or, theoretically. Great stuff in the chat. I love that you guys are helping out, counseling Elfbait on what to do with his players, which is awesome. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Is there anything else I didn't feel like I covered? Let's see. There's more stuff going on in the chat. Elfbait says the implication that the flow of Orcus cultists is coming down from some sort of Thulsa Doom style stronghold in the north. I like that. I'm always down with some Thulsa Doom. Elfbait says XP by mileage, explore with modifiers for different terrains and interesting locations discovered. Yep, I think that's definitely true. Brian Frederick Ork tells Brian Smith to check out Caverns of Thracia. That's an excellent dungeon, and that one does succeed in many ways. It's got a lot of different levels. There's all the decaying of dungeons with playing with the verticality, playing with different environments that are all sort of linked together. Raid LC, hey Raid LC, says, just thinking of my preferred playstyle, I think we could do a whole hexcrawl just with ruins, barrows, castles, and not dungeons. Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're playing something, if you go back and look at something like Pendragon, you can do an awful lot of campaigns with having either very shallow dungeons, like it's really just a session-long dungeon, or even less than that. A small dungeon, sure, we got to go in. There's a cave, and there's a mad hermit who kidnapped the Duke's daughter, and he's in some kind of cave complex. But that's going to be kind of a one-time visit. Something you visit, you solve that problem, you move on to the next thing. And yeah, you concentrate on the weird things happening in forests, castles of lords that you're visiting, things in battles that are happening, and all the intrigue when you're having courts, summer courts, winter courts, all the things that are going on. You might be taking messages, and you have to escape from the from the keep who you took the message into, or you have to sneak in. I mentioned before, you're sneaking into the thing, or you're just doing stuff out and about, or you're taking part in contests and you're going to the jousting and things like that. You could fill a game with tons of locations and interesting heroic or non-heroic, evil, whatever, mercenary things going on. You still be sneaking into an abbey to steal a religious artifact, going into a village and having to sneak in and grab something from there, sneak in, sneak out. All kinds of stuff can happen. You can really get a lot of the sort of experiences without a dungeon. Like we talked about before, you're really splitting out the things that we talk about on a metaphorical level with a dungeon, and you just sprinkle them throughout your overworld. I mean, Pendragon is one of those games that's on my kind of bucket list of games that I own, but I haven't really got a chance to play, that I want to do. And there's very little emphasis in that kind of game in dungeons. And I think you can do that same thing in a more D&D style game. We just have to figure out how to, it is one of the D's in D&D, and you just have to figure out either how to spread this stuff around, or if we are going to minimize it without spreading it around, then how do we replace essentially XP and then the chances for loot? Because those are, if you want to look at what dungeons provide to the party, it's not just loot in terms of experience points, so that is that. So you have experience points and just loot that you're selling or spending. And there's also equipment, right? Your magic, all your sword, all those kind of equipment you're supposed to pick up, magic items, scrolls for spells, all that kind of stuff you're supposed to be kind of finding in dungeons. So if you're just gonna minimize the dungeons, and you're not gonna take that same stuff and just flip it and put it on the surface of the world, take the underworld and just map it onto the overworld, then you have to figure out, well, how are they getting that stuff? And that can easily be done in kind of rewards, or just sneaking into places, or just isolated barrows, downs, treasure locations, or burial locations that might have treasures. You might get, if you do this thing like in Conan, right, when he goes and he gets captured, and I forget who was it, Max von Sydow is playing the local king, and he's like, you love riches, like, here, take all this stuff if you just bring my daughter back from Thulsa Doom. That sets him off to do Thulsa Doom. So you can certainly do all of that, but you just need to just be thoughtful about that stuff, because if you don't, then you end up in, like I was in my game, where like my players are really enjoying all this kind of stuff that's in the overworld, but then they're not being rewarded for it mechanically, because by default the game isn't set up to reward you mechanically for hanging around on the overworld. Radel C says, however, I do like the kind of mythical aspect of Indiana Jones style crypts and dungeons and dangerous discoveries. Yep. And I think you can still have those, but you don't have to. But those, I would call them dungeons, small D's. All those places that Indiana Jones visits basically once and then doesn't go back again, right? He goes in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He goes in that little spot. If you think about that location in Raiders of the Lost Ark, it is one room and a long corridor with some traps in it. There's the poison needle in the wall trap. There's the pit, and then, then the boulder activates down at the end. Then he goes into one room that's got the pressure plates, whatever, the pressure plates on the floor, and then whatever trap in the pedestal. One room, one line corridor. It's fun. You might, in terms of, that's a movie, so it's set in a certain way, and it only takes 5 minutes. If you were going to do that for a session, I would say, make it bigger. But it's basically a location you're coming to once. Okay, you get the idol out of that cave, or that underground, whatever that underground temple, let's call it. Great. Maybe something will make it a lair after you've done that, since you might have tracked. You might have tripped all the traps. You might have tripped all the traps, so then I can live in it. But we're not expecting to go back in there. And that means, as a GM, you don't have to invest a bunch of time making it somewhere that's worth 8 visits. We're just gonna say, it's a one-use thing. You go in there, you find the idol, you get out, it's done. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe I can use it again. If there's, maybe when the party's searching for some outlaw and they're wondering where he went and they're in that general area, maybe we say, ooh, the outlaw went and he's been living out of that same underground temple, but it doesn't fulfill the same monolithic, megalithic, it doesn't fulfill that same purpose, this huge purpose that we put on the shoulders of the capital D dungeon, which both we have to do this, and it takes, this kind of physical presence in the games, but also for our prep, that kind of presence. It can just be a one day dungeon. You go in there, you do it, you leave. Riddles, he says, I do prefer dungeons and dragons in my D&D. Yeah, I don't think I'm trying to say don't have dungeons in your game, but they don't necessarily have to have the huge central importance that they often do when we're reading about dungeons. Hey, Terrence. Oh, yeah, you missed just about everything. But, you know, you can go back and listen to it. Frederick says, you missed a lot. Let's see. Frederick also says, Ultraviolet Grasslands and Lavender Hack are great for exploration and trading. I swear I'm going to get to Lavender Hack and I'm going to get to Ultraviolet Grasslands at some point. And George Rom's Hexcrawl stuff also. Yeah, Frederick, I did watch some of those Hexcrawl videos. Search for George Rom. I don't know what's his. Is George Rom what his YouTube channel is? Hold on, maybe I can find it in another window. Let's see. How can I do this with being the least disruptive possible? I'm just gonna do this. We're at the end anyway. Anything else that I missed? Hopefully, folks found this informative as I'm looking up these videos. Let's see. I think I might have to search. Oh, typos. Let's see. Videos. All right. I'll share this one. You could find. Oh, there's no share. All right. How can I copy link? I'll post that. That should work. I know it's not going to look great if you're trying to type that in from the chat, or if you're seeing this on the screen. He did a series, George Rom, he's a very prolific writer of indie RPGs. He did a bunch of, I think that's the one you're talking about, Frederick, where they did sort of a, it was a really interesting thing to run. There's 3 parts to it. It's really interesting. There's definitely some cool stuff. There's some stuff, the system in general, that I really like about it, and some stuff that I'm not that keen on. Of course, I haven't played it. I'm just listening, but it's really fascinating. And I think, to Frederick's point, is it does move quickly, and I think it does illustrate how you can have a really fun session and potentially multiple sessions of doing things without really engaging in any kind of dungeons. It is very high level. It is very abstracted. And I think you could really take some of that stuff and kind of keep higher level and then delve into things further to give it some more fictional context, but certainly very excellent. Anyone else have any last things on the on this topic anyone has before I close it up? Raid LC says, after I do Ultraviolet Grasslands, I bet he'd come talk on the show. All right, maybe. I mean, I'm always reaching out to anybody I can think of. When I have time, I get lazy sometimes and I don't reach out to people, but I try to. I really like doing the interviews, and I think people like them too. So I just keep reaching out at times. And hey, if anyone knows anyone, if you're in here and you're a creator or someone adjacent to tabletop role-playing games or tabletop stuff and you want to come chat, just drop me a line. I'd love to hear from anybody and anybody. All right, well, I guess this is a wrap on this class. If you came in late, and it looks like a bunch of folks are tuning in late, just go back to the beginning and watch it. This was all the concept here, which hopefully I did an okay job at talking about, was looking at, do we need dungeons in our hex crawls? What do dungeons, what is a dungeon? What purposes it serve? And then delving into, can we take those purposes, if we look at dungeons in a metaphorical sense, can we really pull that stuff out of there and then put it in our games in a different way? And part of what I think spoke to me is, I think by changing the context on some of these things, it can really potentially open up avenues for GMs. It can open up avenues for your party. I think that context can make a big difference, and just opens up some different possibilities from looking at the game. And I think we can do this without losing a whole lot. I just think you can kind of take this stuff and just build it out in different ways, spread it around in a little bit different, and still come up with a really, really cool, fun experience. But maybe you're able to reach some players, reach some of your own creativity and inspiration and fun that maybe you don't feel dungeons that much. Maybe they don't speak to you as much. So maybe, but if you do this in a different way, maybe it will speak to you more. So that was kind of what I was going through. Go back and listen in or watch from the beginning, and then let me know your comments let me know your thoughts in the comments, I should say. Let's see. Radel C says that the name for the Ultraviolet Grasslands is Ray Etz. All right, cool. And Radel says, not that I don't like the solo content, but I appreciate the work that goes into the collabs. Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's all good, and it's a good mix. Because yeah, doing everything myself. I mean, it's easy because I just have to figure out the scheduling for myself. But yeah, I love collaborating, and I hopefully in the future I'll be able to do more. I always want to do more. It's just a matter of what to get scheduled. All right, folks, I'm going to give that a wrap. Hopefully you found it useful. And again, use the comments. Find me on the forums.hex.press. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook. I'm pretty much everywhere. Just search for me. And after you filter out the results for people lifting weights with hex weights, then maybe you'll find me. But other than that, yeah, give a thumbs up on your way out. That would be awesome. If you found yourself in here and you're not subscribed and you want to subscribe, that would also be awesome. But take it easy, everybody. Game on. And I'll talk to you later. Bye, y'all.